that's part of ancient Israelite world. Is that unique between the Israelites and ethnic Arabs in the ancient world? Think for a moment, what national or religious groups in the ancient biblical world were the Israelites really friendly with? Maybe for a generation there was an alliance, but the Israelites were essentially in a relationship of tension with all of the different ethnic, national, and religious groups that were in the ancient Middle East. So this kind of tension that we see here is a natural tension of the ancient world. I think we mitigate that tension somewhat with our political systems today, but there is a kind of natural tension that is a normal part of human behavior. I'm going to now move us up 1,000 years from the ancient history of the Bible and move into the emergence of Islam in the 7th century in Arabia. Muhammad was born in Mecca. Muhammad was born in Mecca, and he was born an orphan. His mother died, his father died before he was born, and his mother died shortly afterwards. He was raised by his grandfather and then his uncle, and he was sort of outside the safety net in Mecca. He was poor, and he was so poor that he wasn't really able to marry until he was already an old man of 25. He married a woman who was a widow of 40, who had previously was involved in, or her husband, her prior husband, late husband, was involved in the transport business. And so Muhammad married into some wealth. This was all before he realized that he was a prophet. So he came from a poor and essentially, I don't want to say unhappy, but didn't have the kind of resources that would be reasonable for people living in Mecca at the time, married into some wealth, didn't really have to work terribly hard after that, and used to engage in meditation outside of town. And when he was meditating in a mountain, in a cave, in Mount Hira outside of Mecca, one day he had his first visitation. An angel appeared to him. The angel's name was Gabriel, and began to give him the message directly from God, his first recitation, which was, get up and warn the people that there will be a day of judgment and that God is demanding more moral, ethical behavior in your town. Muhammad didn't believe that he was receiving a revelation. He thought that he was being possessed by a genie. For any of you who might be familiar with modern Hebrew, one of the ways to say you're crazy in modern Hebrew is tamajnun. It's slang. It comes directly from the Arabic. It means you have been possessed by a jinn, majnun. You've been possessed. So he ran home to his wife, Khadija, and he kind of curled up into a fetal position, and he said, my life is over, I've been possessed, and it's the end of me. And that was the position he was in when he received the second revelation that said, oh, you, wrapped up in your blanket, get up and warn the people. And as he continued to receive these revelations, the revelations included the command to go downtown, to stand up on the equivalent of a soapbox and begin to preach. And he did do that, and he preached a kind of an ethical monotheism that required both the worship of one God and the vision of a God of justice and mercy who demands ethical, humanist behavior from the people in the town. That's a good message. You would think, sure, so let's follow this guy. He's a prophet. Now, in Mecca, there were indigenous Arabian peoples living there, and some people did follow him, particularly the people who were down and out in the communities, you can imagine, people who weren't benefiting from the kind of natural resources and the economic situation of the town. The town was supported by two basic economic bases. One was the transport business, and the other was the religious tourism business. Because Mecca was to use a reasonable word, the Mecca of religion in that region, in the Arabia. That is, this whole area, Arabs from this whole area, including here, all the way around, would come to Mecca at certain times during the year in order to offer their offerings and sacrifices to the various gods that were considered to be in control of the area, and they were established in the city of Mecca. There was in the center a big stone building called the Kaaba, means the cube, and inside of that Kaaba were images and all around in various locations around the Kaaba and in the precincts of Mecca were other places and where you engage in certain kinds of rituals in order to placate or to make offerings to the gods. So when people came to Mecca to do that, you imagine yourself out in the desert and it's hot and you want to come into town and you get a couple of nice meals while you're in town. You have someone take care of your camels, stay in a nice hotel. You might need a guide to take you to the various locations to offer the particular offerings that are necessary. So there was a big business and industry that was what we could call today the religious tourism industry in Mecca at the time. When Mohammad preached against polytheism, and he preached the need to worship a singular God who demands ethical behavior, and that the end of days was nigh, and you would be judged by your worship and your behavior, he became threatening to the religious establishment and the people who were benefiting from the religious tourism industry, and he became persona non grata. Now, there wasn't only Arabian polytheism in Mecca in the 7th century. The Arabia was an area in which there were Jews and Christians and other religious communities as well. In the 7th century Middle East, the only part of the Middle East that wasn't controlled by one of the great empires, the Christian Byzantine Roman Empire or the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, was Arabia. So you can imagine that if you were a religionist, you were a believer, let's say in a form of Christianity that wasn't acceptable to the Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire, there was a totalitarian religious system in which non-Orthodox religious expressions were not accepted. They were persecuted. People came into Arabia in order to be able to live their land, to live their religious life in freedom. Arabia at that time was a kind of a mini, say Pennsylvania or somewhere like that, where people could escape the religious establishment. Jews were found in Arabia and Christians were found in Arabia, and there were a couple of interesting centers. Here in Najran was a Christian center. In the north, in Yathrib, was a Jewish center. There don't seem to have been any Jews living in Mecca or Christians living in Mecca, probably because it was a religious shrine for polytheism. People didn't want to send their kids to schools in town. So Jews congregated around Yathrib, and in this area here, where it says the Wadi al-Qura, and Christians tended to be here in the south area. So when Muhammad was in danger and his life was really threatened, he was able to find refuge in a town in Yathrib. And he was pretty happy about that, apparently, because he expected the Jews to accept him. It was understandable that idolaters, polytheists, wouldn't accept a new prophet who was preaching monotheism. The Jews knew from prophets, right? They had a Bible, they had prophets in the Bible, they knew about monotheism, they knew about that kind of behavior. And so when he came to Medina, that is Yathrib, which is also later called Medina, he expected the Jews to accept him. But what he didn't know was that according to Judaism, official prophecy had ended a few hundred years earlier. And so the Jews weren't willing to accept another prophet. Now, what would have ended official prophecy in Judaism? One kind of pesky prophet was a real problem for Judaism in the 1st century, kind of prophet-like figure. And it was in that century, it seems, according to biblical scholarship, that the canon of the Hebrew Bible was set and established. That pesky prophet, from the Jewish perspective,